Good evening. Order, order. Hello. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming tonight. I'm Gwen Robinson, the president of the Foreign Correspondents Club and editor-at-large of the Nikkei Asian Review. And before we turn to our panel tonight, I'd just like to make a couple of housekeeping announcements about a very interesting lineup we've got coming up this week. Tomorrow night we have a fascinating literary evening called Three Old Soy Dogs Down Memory Lane, which is actually a bunch of authors, Thailand-based, who have their own colourful following, including Colin Cotterill, author of some of these fabulous mystery novels, mainly set in Laos, Roger Crutchley and Jonathan Pritchard, who are all talking about their early experiences in Thailand and some of their work. Promises to be an interesting romp down memory lane. On Friday night, we have New Members Night, which is to welcome quite a large number of people, some of you here tonight, members who've joined this year, but all members are welcome, old and new, Friday night from 7 p.m. So please drop in for a drink and say hello to some old and new faces. And then on Monday, we have the launch of a fascinating study on Thailand's Cybersecurity Act, solutions to stop the state-controlled approach and to promote a human-centred act. This is pardon me. This is an event that's sponsored by the Manusia Foundation in collaboration with the Embassy of the Netherlands in Bangkok and the Thai Netizen Network. Access now, and it will evaluate Thailand's rather draconian cybersecurity laws and discuss. Then finally, just a couple of films you should know about. On Tuesday night, we have a very interesting film, Korumbiara. Thank you, Michael. They shoot Indians, don't they? It's actually about the destruction of the Amazon rainforests, which we're witnessing now. But it's linked to and preceded by, it shows how it's preceded by the destruction of the rights and ancestral lands of the indigenous peoples there. And it will be followed by a Skype question and answer with the director, Vincent Corelli. Please, if you're interested at all in what's happening in the Amazon, which I'm sure you've seen some of the images, truly horrendous, come along. And there will be another film the following week, so please watch our website for that. And turning to the event at hand tonight, the very burning question of Cambodia and whether it is a victim or beneficiary of the big power rivalry that we're seeing in play right now. We have an excellent panel lineup, including from my right, Sebastian Strangio, journalist, author, notably of the definitive biography of Hun Sen, and now working on his new book about China's role in Southeast Asia, is it, or Asia proper? Right, Southeast Asia. And he's come down from Chiang Mai, where he's currently working on his book, to join us tonight. Next to him is Dr. Titinan Pongsudirak, the director of the Institute of Security and International Studies at Chulalongkorn University. I think he needs little introduction. We're very lucky to have him with us tonight. He's done extensive work looking at the dynamics of the region, also in the context of ASEAN and the rising struggle of big powers here. Next to him is Dr. Bradley Merg of the University of Washington in Seattle, but who also spends part of his time working in Cambodia at the Future Forum, an independent think tank, and also at the Cambodian Institute for Cooperation and Peace. has done a lot of work on China in the region, as well as many other things. And finally, also who needs little introduction, Kawi Chongkitavorn, former Nation editor and prominent journalist, and now commentator and senior fellow at the Institute of Security and International Studies at Chulalongkorn. So without further ado, I'd like to turn to the question at hand, but I'd also just like to make the point that I think our discussion tonight should be against a backdrop of, well, first of all, of course, we've all seen images and read a lot of reports in Thailand about the rapacious behavior of Chinese investment in Cambodia, and particularly images of Sihanoukville, the port in the south, and basically what's been portrayed as a new colonization of Cambodia by the Chinese. This all comes against a backdrop of what you could call many years of neglect by Western countries as well, and then sort of a growing rivalry, let's say, between China's very concerted push, Japan, which has hung in there for many years, and recently the reawakening and increasing involvement of the US and other powers that are moving in quite rapidly in Cambodia. So to kick the whole thing off, I'd like to ask Sebastian to start. And I think, Julian, we have some photos taken by Sebastian on a recent trip to Sihanoukville. So over to you, Sebastian.
Thanks, Gwen. So for the 10 minutes that I have available to me, what I'm hoping to do is to provide some context for my fellow panelists, for the comments of my fellow panelists. While the Chinese takeover of Cambodia has become a very current topic of media reporting over the past couple of years, this is part of a much longer process. This is not a new thing, even though it has become increasingly visible over the past few years, particularly in places like Sihanoukville. And the speed of this transformation has been actually, quite remarkable. I left Cambodia in the middle of 2016. At the time, there was very little visible Chinese presence in Sihanoukville. 3 years later, and it is amazing to see the transformation of that city. Parts of Phnom Penh that, were once quiet, leafy streets are now buzzing with Chinese restaurants, neon-lit signs. The visible Chinese investment presence is more visible now than ever before in Cambodia. But what I want to do is offer a little bit of historical background to try and tell the story of how we got where we are now. So in many ways, it's really no surprise that Cambodia and China are very close partners. We could look back to the pre-colonial history of Cambodia. During that time, the Cambodian kingdom didn't really fear China. Unlike the Vietnamese or the Burmese, who shared borders with China, the Cambodians existed at a safe remove from the power of the Chinese state. They were much more concerned about the two powers to either side, the Kingdom of Siam and the Vietnamese to the east. And so the natural inclination of Cambodian strategic culture is to look externally for a protector that can safeguard Cambodia's territorial integrity and independence from encroachments by outside powers. And in the middle of the 19th century, they looked to France, which established a protectorate in 1863, which many historians believe probably protected Cambodia, prevented Cambodia from being partitioned, divided, and absorbed by its two traditional rivals. More recently, since independence in 1953, Cambodian leaders have tended to look to China. Norodom Sihanouk, the ruler of the country through the 50s and 60s, saw China explicitly as a guarantor of Cambodia's independence from the two countries on either side, which he described as traditional enemies and jackals. The same was true of Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge, who forged a very tight alliance with the PRC. And the same is also true of Hun Sen. Now, I also want to suggest that Hun Sen's current Chinese embrace is inseparable from the unique political trajectory that Cambodia has undertaken since the end of the Cold War. And I'm speaking specifically about the Paris Peace Agreements and the rebirth of Cambodia as a democratic state under the aegis of the international community, international NGOs, and foreign aid money. And this, this peace agreement was basically designed to remove Cambodia from the international agenda after so many decades in which the country had been a proxy of the Cold War. But it also sought to create a fresh start for Cambodia, to put it on the tracks towards a democratic future and a situation in which human rights would be respected and the country would move towards peace, stability, democracy, and so forth. And the UN mission that was sent to Cambodia in 1992 and 1993 to implement the treaty has, I believe, profoundly shaped Western perceptions of Cambodia ever since. Cambodia at that time became a pet project of what was seen to be a dawning liberal international order. The Paris Agreements were signed in October 1991, which was just 2 months before the final collapse of the Soviet Union. And this was an era that was an era of liberal triumphalism following the end of the Cold War. People like Francis Fukuyama were talking about the end of history, and it was widely believed that the world would henceforth converge on a single Western model of liberal democracy, free markets, and human rights. And I think Cambodia became a sort of outpost of that liberal optimism in the early 1990s, and the country became a project of that sort of spirit. Now, there are a number of reasons that Cambodia continues to be viewed this way. I think one of them is that the country is very small and is often perceived as strategically unimportant. And this has allowed Western governments to essentially, they view Cambodia as, because it's not that important, it's a place where we can take a stand. As an American official said of Myanmar in the late 1980s, it's a country where we have the luxury of standing up for our principles. I think it's also due to the efforts of the Cambodian opposition, which has a great part of its strategy has been to appeal to international constituencies, and it's helped to reinforce this idea of Cambodia as a democracy in waiting. And they've dedicated a lot of their attention towards lobbying the U.S. Congress and the European Parliament to put pressure on the Cambodian government to realize this democratic promise of the early 1990s. And of course, the last piece of this puzzle, of course, is Prime Minister Hun Sen, a figure who has now been in power for 3.5 decades almost, and who really fit the role of villain perfectly in this post-Cold War narrative about Cambodia's democratic transition. Hun Sen was a very easy guy to cast as the bad guy, from his Castro-esque rambling speeches to his ruthless use of power to maintain his political position, to his outbursts against the West. He fit that role very well. And even today, I want to suggest that Cambodia is still treated essentially as a special case. The country is often held to a much higher standard than its neighbors are in terms of human rights and democratic standards. And this, is still, at least until very recently, because the country was perceived as not that important. Alienating the Cambodians did not endanger any significant strategic interests. But this status as a special project has always been deeply resented by Hun Sen and the CPP. I don't have a lot of time to go into the 1980s and the history of the decade preceding the end of the Cold War. Suffice to say that the CPP saw the West as hypocritical and basically saw the coming of democracy as, rather than being a fresh start for Cambodia, they saw it as a more sophisticated way of removing them from power under the flag of convenience of democracy promotion. And so I think this is how we need to understand the current political crackdown in Cambodia. The proximate cause is, of course, the CPP's weakening hold on power and the rising popularity of the opposition Cambodian National Rescue Party. But at a deeper level, this is also about repudiating the international settlement of 1991 and shrugging off a burden that the CPP has always resented and has never really fully accepted. And this is where China comes in. China has offered, in many ways, the reverse of this post-Cold War liberal vision. They offer a vision of development based on sovereignty and non-interference, two ideas which are music to Hun Sen's ears. And they have provided the diplomatic backing and the alternative sources of financial support that have allowed Hun Sen to weather the wave of Western pressure that has followed in the wake of the abolition of the opposition in 2017 and the one-horse victory at last year's national elections. And this brings us to the present, which is an increasing concern in Washington about the rising Chinese influence in Cambodia, which reached a peak in July when the Wall Street Journal published a report alleging a secret deal to allow the Chinese Navy access to a Cambodian naval base on the Gulf of Thailand. And now people are finally talking about Cambodia in the U.S. In the context of this fear of that the country is going to become essentially a colony of China in the middle of mainland Southeast Asia. And I think I want to make the point that I think the U.S. to a certain extent bears some responsibility for this. Ever since the early 90s, Cambodia has been subject to a sort of benign neglect. Through the 90s and early 2000s, Cambodia policy was basically dictated by a small number of congressmen with an axe to grind against Hun Sen for a number of reasons, which I can go into later. And so the country was always, subject to Hun Sen was never really accepted by the U.S. The U.S. has been mostly disinterested in the country, and engagement with the Hun Sen government by local ambassadors was generally seen as taboo. I've interviewed former ambassadors who said there was severe limits on what they could do in building relationships with the Cambodian government because of this congressional pressure. So this has contributed to a spiral of mutual incomprehension that has led fairly logically to the current point of crisis. And I think this manifests a wider tendency in American views of Cambodia, which is to see the country essentially as a proxy for a wider strategic, political, or ideological struggle. During the Cold War, Cambodia was seen through the prism of the struggle against communism. In the post-Cold War era, it was the ideology of democracy promotion. And in the current era, my concern is that Cambodia has now found itself entangled in the increasing tensions between China and the United States, and very much runs the risk of falling victim to, finding itself once again a proxy of a superpower conflict. And so, the danger of Cambodia becoming a victim of this new Cold War, as some people are calling it, is quite considerable. And I think it will require agile and creative diplomacy in order to rescue the relationship between Cambodia and the United States and ensure that that doesn't happen. Thank you.
And next, over to you, Dr. Thitinan. In fact, does anybody want to rescue the relationship between Cambodia and the United States? It doesn't look to me that the US does.
Okay, thank you, Gwen. Good evening to everyone. That's a very good context for us to dive into, Sebastian. I think I'll just say a couple of main points. I think that the first, geography and size matter. Cambodia is in a certain spot on the map, and it has a certain size. I think this is consequential for its international standing, relations with a superpower, and role in the neighborhood. So you've heard some historical timeline. You could say that Cambodia has had a very bumpy millennium. 1,000 years ago, they were the top dog in the region, in the neighborhood. But over 1,000 years, things have been very different. They were first supplanted by Sukhothai kingdom, then kind of subjugated, alternately between different players in Siamese history, the UTR period, and then that brought them to the European colonialism, the French, and so on. And then they even had a kingdom, as you mentioned, 53 to 70, and then a little bit of a republic, and then Pol Pot, Khmer Rouge, from 1975, and the Vietnamese invasion. December 25th, 1978, within 2 weeks, Vietnam controlled Cambodia. And then the 1980s, right? In the 1980s, in fact, if you think about it, the U.S. supported the Khmer Rouge with China. The U.S.-China realignment mattered because they were the basis for the support for the three, rebel factions alliance fighting the Heng Samrin government at that time. Hun Sen was on the other side. He was the enemy of China and the U.S. from 1985, and in fact, Vietnam cultivated and groomed him at a young age to lead the Heng Samrin government. And then, the 1980s, the end of the Cold War. I think the key was that the early 90s was a period of hope and aspiration. There was a kind of even they call it a third wave. There was a wave of democratization. Eastern Europe, the post-Soviet Union, the Soviet collapse, the disintegration, different countries are coming up, the disintegration of Yugoslavia as well. And so you had the 1990s as a kind of a period of exuberance, democratic exuberance. You can see it here in Thailand too. After 1992, they had a constitutional reform leading to a constitution in 1997. So the 1990s was a period of democratic breakthroughs in a lot of places. In Cambodia, as we know from the Jakarta informal meetings in 1991, it eventually led to the election. I think it was on May 23rd, 1993. I was there in my earlier life as a reporter with The Nation. And it was a period of great promise. I mean, this was a country at war and really kind of being slapped around by different players. It was heavily bombed by the Americans. A lot of people had a lot of guilt over Cambodia. The world, of course, the Khmer Rouge killed a lot of people. It was dramatized. It became a Hollywood story. So people rallied behind it. So early 1990s, Cambodia has had elections in 93, 98, 03, 08, 13, 18. 6 elections later now. But had it gone the other way, Cambodia would not be so close to China. In fact, the more elections they've had, the more the opposition has been winning. And in the 2018 elections, all things being equal, if the CNLP hadn't been dissolved, Kem Sokha hadn't been harassed, and Sam Rainsy in exile and all of that, and if the Cambodian workers in Thailand are allowed to vote, the CNLP would have won. So in fact, you have to look at the Cambodia's relations in the neighborhood and its role really inextricably linked to its domestic politics. Hun Sen's been losing his grip at home, so he's been consolidating, and he's done it the harsh and brutal way, the best way he knows, which is to decimate the opposition, jail them, harass them, chase them to exile, arrest them. So you have all these opposition members now in the diaspora, and they've come through Thailand, and there's a new trend here I want to note. Thailand used to be, next door countries in Southeast Asia used to be natural refuge for dissidents, no longer. So the Cambodian dissidents who've been here from the opposition have been harassed. They've had to go to another country. And same with Thais in neighboring countries. So this is why China has towered over Cambodia. And Cambodia being a small country with a strategic kind of location next to the sea, unlike Laos, is fair game for China. But because Cambodia has become an elected dictatorship, it falls naturally right into China's embrace. And we see it vividly. I mean, of course, this has consequences for regional cooperation within the ASEAN context. Cambodia has been kind of the China's Trojan horse within ASEAN. So China can exercise a veto through Cambodia at will when it wants, when it suits China's interests. We saw it in 2012, but since then there have been a number of instances where Cambodia was doing the bidding for China. And if Cambodia is not enough, China also has Laos. If Laos is not enough and Cambodia and Laos not enough, China also has Brunei. And if that's not enough, China can squeeze a few more players, maybe even Thailand, to go its way. This is how China has kind of influenced, interfered with, but also imposed its will on ASEAN outcomes. If the outcomes don't affect China's core interests, then China will let it go. But if it comes to the South China Sea, for example, can we have the map, please?
Yes.
if it comes to China's core interest, for example, of course, China will exercise its virtual veto. Now, this is the thing. I don't like to use PowerPoint with my students because now that you're all looking at the map. Please just look at me for just a couple more minutes, and then I'll let you look at the map. It's just a generic map. You can get it from the internet, but I just want to illustrate so that you can see. So now on the map, okay, now please put out the map, and you can look at the map now. There's the South China Sea. There's a bunch of rocks and reefs, and China has claimed and built 7 artificial islands. So these would be Subi and Mischief and Reed Bank and Johnson South, and they have actually these names. But they have weaponized. China has weaponized these islands, and as you can tell, the 9 dashed lines, that's the map that China has claimed, and it covers pretty much all of South China Sea, overlapping with, of course, Vietnam, Philippines, but also Malaysia, Brunei, and then also Taiwan and Indonesia a little bit. These 7 artificial islands weaponized. They now have radar system, they have airstrips, so it's a full military basis. I mean, these are military bases. Cambodia now is, as Sebastian has alluded to, is talking to China about having a base at Reem. So this would be very close to Sihanoukville. So this would give China a different kind of military base. It would complement the string of weaponized artificial islands in the South China Sea. Those artificial islands, by the way, in times of conflict, they'll be easy targets. The U.S. will just demolish them. I mean, I've heard from the DoD people, they're not concerned about the artificial islands. But these artificial islands serve some intelligence purposes, also some logistics. And if China can build, they have Hambantota in Sri Lanka, Pakistan, they have Gwadar, they have a little bit if they have a base in Cambodia, and Hun Sen has denied this, but of course Hun Sen has made these denials before that it would violate the constitution, but he's violated the constitution before, so I think this could be very viable, and it could be happening, and eventually it will happen probably, I think. Already you have commercial interests, tourism and so on, but I think the military base would be the next logical step for China. This would change the strategic landscape in maritime Southeast Asia, in the maritime domain. The U.S. is more aggressive now, more freedom of operation, navigational patrols. They call this FONOPS, freedom of navigation, operational patrols. And the U.S. Is shifting more forces here, spending more money. The national defense strategy, national security strategy, the free and open Indo-Pacific. So with the U.S. pressing a bit harder vis-a-vis China with a trade war, tech war, and I call it a non-military war. It's all kinds of statecraft instruments short of military. Hun Sen is having maybe a little bit of a second thought, I think. He's having a little bit of a second thought. He's pretty much in China's pocket, the regime. But if Trump continues to press hard, this will allow some leverage for the ASEAN countries. And you can see the ASEAN countries have come up with the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, which is a response to the free and open Indo-Pacific, which in turn is a response to China's Belt and Road Initiative. I'm just thinking that if Trump, becomes more belligerent, instead of seeing Hun Sen becoming more on China's leash, maybe it might go the other way. Maybe Hun Sen, I think that ASEAN countries don't like to be completely in China's pocket. All of them want to have some leverage and some bargaining positions. Before, under the Obama administration, there was none, because Obama was very harsh on human rights and democracy in elections, and he was a supporter of Aung San Suu Kyi. He was not a fan of Hun Sen. He supported the opposition. Trump, very different. Values, democratic values, not paramount to him. Interests are paramount. And so with this different kind of mix, China also has a lot of issues on its plate. I mean, China has been realigning with Japan a little bit, because I think the trade tech war, the non-military war, is hurting China. China has the Korean Peninsula, it has India, it's trying to get its Belt and Road to become more accept it. That's why it's working partly with Japan in third countries. So China is stepping back a little bit, just, also internal stresses within China. So if Trump more belligerent, China has more, pretty much a full plate. Japan, I think, also is a key player in mainland Southeast Asia. So this is something that, we could see Hun Sen going the other way as long as the Western democracies don't press on human rights in elections and democracy. The US probably may not, but the EU is. And the EU may impose sanctions via the EBA. I think that in the coming months we will see if the EU imposes sanctions. If they do, it'll be debilitating, and Hun Sen will be forced further into China's embrace. So if the West presses too hard, then China. If Trump presses very hard, the West kind of stay their ground, then maybe Hun Sen will exercise a little bit more leverage vis-a-vis China. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think you're saying that there's a bit of victim and beneficiary in that equation. Anyway, we'll come back to that. Bradley, over to you.
Thank you, Gwen. I'll just sort of begin with an anecdote from about 2 weeks ago. I was in Bavet, which is on the border of Cambodia and Vietnam. If you've never been, I don't recommend it. If you're looking to build a bicycle factory, absolutely brilliant place. If you're looking for a charming holiday location, I'd recommend Sihanoukville. But it was absolutely fascinating because it presented the sheer duality of the Chinese experience of Cambodia. On the one hand, driving into Bavet, arriving at about 4:35 p.m. at a factory shift change, we're seeing trucks upon trucks, a current estimate of 80,000 Cambodians working in 4 special economic zones. This is Svay Rieng province. These are individuals that are underemployed. If they would either be living in villages or they would be part of Cambodia's very large outgoing migrant sector, many here in Thailand. Significant industrial development. I'd been there a year earlier, and it was a sea change from what we'd seen in terms of Cambodia's economic integration with Vietnam, driven by Vietnamese investment, but Chinese investment as well. Now, Chinese investment in Cambodia has been to some degree overplayed, particularly when we talk about the garment sector. When we talk about the garment sector, which we all know is 17 to 20% of exports, about 40 to 50% of that isn't mainland Chinese. That's Taiwan and that's Hong Kong. Although Chinese investment is quite significant. And it has changed China. It has changed Cambodia. It has resulted in the perception of the country being simply a perpetual aid recipient to significant industrial development granted at the absolute bottom rung of that ladder of production. But Bavet was interesting for a couple of other reasons as well. I happened to arrive with colleagues, and we were putting a survey into the field, which we'll be releasing in December. It's the first survey of Cambodian popular opinions towards China. We chose Bavet for various reasons, one of which being that it had a very significant Chinese investment. The other being the fact that its other major industry is gambling. And if you go around the casinos of Bavet, most people are Vietnamese. They're playing in Dong. And what was quite surprising was we'd arrived about a week and a half to 2 weeks after the online gambling ban had taken place. And a colleague of mine and I went to the main street in Bavet and sat down, and he chatted with Khmer staff, and I chatted in Mandarin with some of the younger 25, 30-year-old Chinese guys who worked in this industry. And what was most fascinating was everyone telling us, both Khmer and Chinese, 2/3 of the city's gone in the last week and a half. The online gambling ban, basically everybody is up sticks, gone to Phnom Penh, taken the Bentley, taken the Rolls Royce. You would have seen this place packed 2 weeks ago. Everybody's left. And this, of course, came from Prime Minister Hun Sen's banning of online gambling and then close collaboration and coordination with the Chongqing police doing extensive arrests in Sihanoukville and Bavet. Now, this is something that China had been pressuring Cambodia for 5 to 6 months to carry out because many of these online gambling firms were engaged in VoIP scams targeting Chinese government officials in China and doing it from essentially the protection of Sihanoukville and Bavet. But this was also a population that have heavily contributed to rising criminality in Sihanoukville. Less so in Bavette. We've seen a rise in methamphetamine abuse and some degree of crime. But that is sort of in a nutshell the reality. It's a difficult answer of victim or beneficiary, because we do see this strong level of investment, but we also see some very, very unpleasant aspects that have resulted in a very significant blowback and response from the Cambodian populace. Now, if we shift out of the question of investment and more into the question of Chinese aid and the Chinese aid model, in Cambodia, things become, actually, in my view, as a political economist, quite a bit more interesting. Because we begin to have a very interesting case study to evaluate the Belt and Road Initiative and to begin to understand how it actually operates. And just as much as we look at the positive and negative of China in Bavette, we do have to look at BRI with the sense of a supply and demand side. China being the supply, Cambodia being the demand. Obviously, the implications of BRI in Laos have been considerably different from the implications of BRI in Cambodia, calling into question, does regime type, regime consolidation fundamentally alter the outcomes of BRI in terms of development endings? But what's been most interesting overall, as regards Chinese aid, is the significant undercount of projects. We have no official number from China as to the number of projects currently available. The Council for the Development of Cambodia, to their credit, have significantly improved the quality of data available as regards the number of Chinese aid programs that are officially recognized. However, that number, even the official number, is below the ChinaAidData.org out of College of William and Mary, which I think lists around 135, 140. But if we expand out, and this comes into some degree of a debate as to what we understand as official development assistance and what we do not, but if we take a broad definition of that, over the last 4 years of field research and trying to gain data access, I've counted over 600 distinct aid projects. Because aid is not just central government aid. In Cambodia, we have aid from Chinese provinces to Cambodian provinces. We have aid from Chinese cities to Cambodian cities. We have to remember that Chinese governance is not simply a centrally led or centrally driven activity. Each province has a foreign affairs ministry. Everyone wants to be on board with BRI. Everyone wants to signal that they are on the team with President Xi's signature initiative. This has created chaos. This has created, and as anyone who's ever worked in the field of aid knows, complete fragmentation and a total absence of transparency as what's going on. When we see the province of Zhejiang give Siem Reap $250,000 for roads, we see a nice signing ceremony, a nice publication in the Chinese media, and then we hear nothing about it ever again. We see no record of it on the books in the provincial budget. We see nothing else. This is a severe problem. And this relates broadly to China's approach. The talk of China's aid model towards Cambodia and to others does tend to go into the debt trap diplomacy question. I agree with the IMF assessment that Cambodia is not in that stage remotely at this point in time. Cambodia's debt level, 35% or so, is perfectly manageable, although we have seen China take control of a majority of that debt. The question that China, and that really needs to be pushed and asked about China, is if China's BRI program and its aid program is part of its narrative of being a responsible player, why will China not sign up? And why has China not signed up to OECD, Development Assistance Committee, best practice rules, the Busan Declaration and the Paris Declaration? These are rules that Slovenia and Hungary follow. If Hungary, not exactly known as a major aid superpower, can follow, what is the issue with China? And the reason this matters is because those declarations declare certain rules. The first one, of course, being transparency. We would love to know what exactly China is doing in terms of its aid programs. Why? Because we know coordination of aid is fundamental and it's important. The second, however, is really the biggest critique I have of BRI in Cambodia, is the fact that this is tied aid. This is aid and China's not the first country to do this. Japan did this, the United States did this. In fact, China's aid model is remarkably similar to what Japan did in the 1970s. Bricks and mortar, infrastructure, and loans. However, China's loans are not at the same concessionary level that Japan did, nor the United States, nor ADB. But the bigger issue is that if you're going to basically take out a loan, you're going to build a dam, you're going to build a road, and so on and so forth. Well, China is going to be the one to build it, and it's going to be a particular state-owned enterprise. This is export of excess domestic capacity by another name. Now, that can be win-win, noting the $129 billion infrastructure investment gap in Asia that ADB says we have by 2030. But that doesn't mean we should simply accept aid at all costs, particularly in a country like Cambodia, where absorption capacity of that amount in terms of actual organization, et cetera, remains quite weak. If we move on to the question of Chinese investment, it's a similar story. There's good investment. There's absolutely good investment from China in Cambodia. One firm, for example, even simply in the construction real estate sector, the UA Thai Group, have done their best to basically be responsible corporate citizens and have quite a solid, we're here to help Cambodia, and it appears that they're quite correct. Conversely, we have a large firm called the Prince Group. Prince Banking, Prince Real Estate, absolutely enormous. Good luck getting information out of them. It's quite intriguing. The general view among scholars who focus on Cambodia is it's part of United Front work to some degree, and it's a conduit for support for particular officials in the government. Even Cambodians that work there will openly state that they are unfamiliar what happens above a certain floor level, and that staff come in from other places. But it's this level of lack of transparency that raises serious problems for China in Cambodia and for China's broader program of aid, not just there, but throughout the region. Because it has raised significant opposition. In the Cambodian press, in the Cambodian media, we consistently see stories of Chinese behaving badly. Now, the online gambling ban will do quite a bit to fix that. The Ministry of the Interior stated that over the course of 1 month, 100,000 Chinese had left the kingdom. Fun number, doesn't really tell us anything because that's just the total number of passport holders that have left. That's it. That includes tourists who are in and out, everything else. Estimates from the Chinese community in Cambodia who have a reasonable number is that there's approximately today 500,000 Chinese citizens resident in Cambodia. We've probably seen a drop of 40 to 50,000 in my estimate over the course of the last month, coming out of Sihanoukville, coming out of Poi Phet, coming out of Bavet, and leaving Phnom Penh. Many back to China, many making preparations, particularly those engaged in online gambling, for moving to the Philippines in light of the Philippines' maintenance of that sector as being open. Ultimately, this goes down to the question that one of the variables that's constantly missed in Cambodia is that Cambodia has a deep norm of nationalism at the end of the day. And I think this is actually one of the most terrifying aspects of China's role in the region, is this sort of assumption that Cambodia will just roll over. And I haven't seen that. In meetings, I've sat in meetings between representatives of the Cambodian and Chinese governments as a consulting economist. And I've seen Cambodia push back on particular aspects and said, no, well, we want this, we need this. It's not a simple Beijing calls and Cambodia jumps so high. This is a sovereign state, and there is a very deep well of nationalism. And evidence that we've started to see from survey research indicates, particularly among younger Cambodians, those who have essentially received the bulk of their news from online sites like Fresh News for the Government or Tmai Tmai, the brooding well of anti-Chinese sentiment is simply enormous. And the concern is what happens when something sets this off. What happens, we saw the Vietnamese riots against China, what happens in Cambodia when this occurs? And the online gambling ban is a very wise move by the government to begin to signal to the population that it's taking this issue seriously. Just as we saw the Prime Minister go to Sihanoukville when we saw the building collapse a couple of months ago, directly on the helicopter, appointing a new provincial governor, recognizing that popular sentiment about China is severe, it's bad, and it's getting worse. And the government has to deal with this. I'm running out of time, so just sort of briefly. BRI itself in Cambodia is sort of a perfect encapsulation of BRI globally, of Xi Jinping making the classic mistake of ignoring Deng Xiaoping and running before he can walk. This initiative was trotted out much too early. We have 13 different Chinese ministries that have some degree of control over BRI. We have minimal central coordination. We have public diplomacy nightmares in the form of what's happened in Sri Lanka and in various African states as well. And what's interesting, though, is that China is learning, and China is a novice at this. So we should expect, this is not a story of an evil Beijing seeking to take control of the world through debt traps and grossly oversimplified. It's a story of really a lack of competence. Of a much larger program. Conversely, when we look at something like the Lansang Mekong initiative, we see China taking a much more nuanced approach, clearly having learned and taken on board the lessons from BRI in terms of working with stakeholders, in terms of public diplomacy, and so on and so forth. I'll just sort of finish off with sort of a topic that we can discuss in the Q&A. Is the U.S. relationship with Cambodia along these lines? Obviously, this is the site of contestation, proxy conflict between the Americans and the Chinese. Obviously, the new ambassador, Ambassador Murphy, is arriving very soon, and he's laid out his agenda as to what the U.S. will be focusing on. And it seems relatively positive as a potential reset. And for Cambodia's side, over the last few months, with the exception of late July, which was particularly painful, we did see a very strong attempt by Cambodia to work towards a reset. Whether that's feasible at this stage remains very much up in the air. From all that I've understood from Washington and so on and so forth, it's sort of fish or cut bait time. The military base is widely viewed as true, even if the perception is that very few people in the government actually know about it. A very small number, including many upper-level officials in the government, that it does exist. But if that does exist, and if there is actual physical evidence, then taking a capital R realist approach, what we ultimately should see, what the U.S. government's policy would be the classic kill the monkey to scare the chickens. Make an example of Cambodia, because any assistance or aid would be de facto resulting in a positive benefit for China as opposed to the United States. Cambodia, with Ambassador Murphy's arrival, has the opportunity to make a clean break, to basically go to a multilateral foreign policy with some sort of signaling mechanism as to its independence. Offers of cooperation on counterterrorism, et cetera, small-scale stuff probably isn't going to be sufficient. It's going to have to be something big, and it's something that's going to have to be quick, particularly noting the fact that the Cambodia Democracy Act is making its way through the U.S. Senate as we speak. And in an election year, it's going to be very hard to find anyone in the Senate who is going to stand up and say, oh yes, I'm going to wave the flag for Hun Sen. And oh yes, in an election year, I'm going to wave the flag for what is being framed in D.C. as a Chinese client state. It's gone through the Congress before. Previously, it didn't make it into the Senate. This year is a different dynamic, so it's going to be quite interesting to see. And with that, I apologize for going slightly over time.
Thank you very much for that excellent fact-packed presentation. I think one thing you didn't really say was that the price of that reset on the Cambodian side, and they know very well, is to conform to some of the demands of not just the US but the EU, and let go of, the cosy political structure that Hun Sen has nicely set up for himself after demolishing the opposition. So I think the price of that reset would be very high for Hun Sen. But we can come back to that, and perhaps, Kawi, you have some thoughts as a long-time observer, and I think the first ever foreign correspondent from Thailand or per se that was allowed to set up in Cambodia under Hun Sen? Was that 1980 whatever?
She was saying that I'm a running dog of Hun Sen.
No, I was not.
But I'm not. It's good to be here, Gwen. I plan to speak 10 points, but Sebastian took away 3 points. Titinan, 2 points. And my good friend Brad, with the latest assessment, took almost everything. So I was left with a dilemma. I will focus
Can you speak into the microphone?
I will pick up on what Sebastian has said. Actually, everything you said about Cambodia and China is all about Hun Sen. Hun Sen is Machiavellian, and he will change. Sebastian has laid a very good framework. He talked about the history. Actually, Cambodia was trapped by history. But one more historical development is that Cambodia was trapped by personalities. And Hun Sen will determine everything that will come out, whether it's US relation, whether it's EU relation, whether it's Thai-Cambodia relation, whether Cambodia engagement with China actually is still work in progress. That is my take. I would like to focus my analysis on Hun Sen. It all started in 1998 when Hun Sen suddenly realized that he will become the prime minister and have over control. He was fading up, as Sebastian said, all the framework laid down by Paris Peace Agreement. I was there in 1991. That was the first time I went to Paris along with all the cabal of journalists based in Bangkok. And that was the best time from Cambodia. Cambodia was used as an example of the best work of peacemaking of the history of UN programs. So it was a very big disappointment that it did not turn out that way. So in 1998, it was the first time that Cambodia under Hun Sen realized that if I want to remain in power, I must make a big move. That is to choose a major power that I can rely on. That is China. This is why he made a swift change later, a year later, in late 1999. Since then, all the history that has been laid out by these three gentlemen. But what Hun Sen really wants in his mind is two things. He wants to be known in the Cambodian history as the father of New Cambodia. If you read his speech time and again and his comment time and again, he always lamented that modern Cambodia, which he, along with other CGDK at the time, I don't want to talk about the other former coalition. I mentioned CGDK because I was a journalist cover that part. Hun Sen realized that he wants to stay on. That is why a couple of years back, he urged media, to call him Somdet Akra Moha Seni Padai Desho Hun Sen. That is a full name. It's as if he was like a monarchy, but it's not. It's the Lord Prime Minister Supreme, translated into English, Supreme Military Commander Hun Sen. So deep down, Hun Sen won his legacy. But at the moment, he was not certain. Why? The only thing that will make his history, his embed in the history, is to make sure that economic continue to rise. And the only country that will make economic in Cambodia rise non-stop is China. Because Cambodia was fed up with consortium of donor. I covered Cambodia at that time. Cambodia was so fed up because, values and norm. Norway said no, other countries said no. Cambodia just said, well, why don't I just get some help from China? That, I think, 1998 forward, that has really changed. So Hun Sen focused on this and thinking of his legacy. And that is very important because in Cambodia, there is one concept just like Thailand, Barame. In Thai we call Barami, but in Cambodia it's called Barame, means the aura of power. At the moment, Hun Sen is dying to have this Barame intact. But he knows that younger generation born after 1991, October, has not shown any appreciation of his work. He always lamented in private or, with others saying that, young generation always forget that I forged the peace process. I allow international troops to come in. I first start out with the two prime minister until 1998. I tried to keep the Paris Peace Accord with, after almost thing collapsed, he asked Ng Huat at the time foreign ministers to stay on. So that was the first one. Hun Sen wanted to sustain his legacy as the father of New Cambodia and maintain his Barame through sustainment of economic progress. Number two, as a leader, as Sebastian has said, 3 decades and a half, actually it will be much more if you add 10 more years from now on. That's what he said. Hun Sen wants to be remembered just like Lee Kuan Yew, just like Mahathir Mohamad, as the peacemaker in the regional history. Hun Sen is very aware of that. He wants to be known, remembered in the region within ASEAN. In fact, the role of Hun Sen in ASEAN is very interesting. In 2003, 2005, Hun Sen was the most powerful ASEAN leader in history of ASEAN because he was the balancer, he chipped and changed. But later on, I think he lost out. Of course, people still mention Cambodia, the act of 2012. But for me, I keep saying that it was an aberration. It will not happen again. It happened because of Hon Nam Hong. It happened because of disconnectedness of Hon Nam Hong with the rest of ASEAN leaders. Because there are several cases in history of ASEAN where disconnected of ASEAN leader at the time, delay all the process. It took a long time, but it was exceptional. So I think it's a little bit erroneous to determine saying that that was China. That was China pressure. Certainly, there's Chinese pressure, just like Chinese pressures toward Thailand. At this just latest ASEAN ministerial meeting, have you seen the joint communiques on the statement on the South China Sea? It was a little bit tough, actually tougher than expected. As you can see that ASEAN expressed concern over serious incidents. That was the formula that came out. So what I'm trying to say is that Cambodia, as Sebastian has said, that it's not on call all the time. Come on. Hun Sen is Machiavellian. He makes his own decision. And I think when the time comes, I think you will laugh at me if I say that. Cambodia will say that enough is enough. I will go for somebody else. But by that time, you will ask, with this kind of deep engagement, which has been going on for over 10 years, can really Hun Sen really stand up and walk away? Maybe not, but there will be something else. And I think, as Brad mentioned, I think there are some adjustment that has been made now in recent months. In fact, constantly Hun Sen review his position constantly and study the balancing game of all major power. No other ASEAN country in mainland Southeast Asia that has playing balancing game so well as in Cambodia. It's in the Cambodian DNA, not the Thai. The Thai, I think, has failed during the past 5 years. We live in the freezer under the military. So now we are out of the freezer now. So Cambodia has done a good job. So it's still work in progress. I personally believe that Hun Sen has a lot more to do with China. And I think the shape and the structure in the future is not yet really fixed. There's still a lot of leeways for Hun Sen. That's it, that I would like to say.
Well, thank you very much, Kelly, for that insight. Before we turn the floor over to questions, I'd just like to, with the moderator's prerogative, maybe follow up on a couple of things. One is, that's a fascinating mixed set of views we've had from some real experts here, which I'm still not sure where I see the balance, whether you really think that Cambodia is, a victim or a beneficiary, whether Hun Sen is in a stronger or weaker position as a result of everything we've heard. But one thing is for sure, and I think, Bradley, you picked up on this with the survey results, which in my many trips to Cambodia sort of plays out with me and probably with you, Sebastian, and others, that there is this vociferous feeling amongst young people, and also in Sihanoukville, as you, I think, noted, Sebastian, of a real backlash going on, that actual genuine aversion or distress or anger about the kind of volume of Chinese investment and the nature of it. Of course, people aren't complaining about bridges and roads, but as I think one of you noted, they are not happy about the tacky casinos, the proliferation of prostitution, the, shoddy apartment buildings that collapse, which is unfair because that's only one major disaster. But this backlash thing is real and possibly building up. Interestingly, you said, Bradley, that older people don't quite feel that sense of outrage. And maybe that's similar also in, I don't know, probably other parts of, I haven't polled in Laos or Thailand. But anyway, the point is that one thing we haven't really addressed is succession. And Hun Sen clearly has this dynastic idea, as Coe said, of, this kind of godlike or monarchic kind of view. So he's got his sons lined up and he's determined to put one in and keep a dynastic succession. He's banned the opposition and locked people up, or, they've expelled themselves. So how do we square all this? How does all this reconcile? This clear issue of a backlash building amongst the general populace. Meanwhile, you're saying that he's cunning and smart and he's pulling back. So we've got an online gambling ban. That doesn't do anything about 85 casinos in Sihanoukville and loads of condominiums, which I don't think the Chinese are going to vacate very quickly. So I'd just like a comment from possibly each of you or any of you who'd like to respond to that. Who'd like to go first? Maybe.
Yeah, what was the question?
Well, the question is, how do you reconcile this issue of this clear backlash that we've heard about amongst the young, and I think all of us would agree that you're seeing a lot of that, with the observation that Hun Sen's smart enough and is pulling back a little bit to kind of and play things well. It doesn't seem so smart if the backlash is that going to dissipate, and will he, are we looking at a succession that he is planning? Or do you think it could all blow up in his face and China could dump him?
I think one of the most notable things about the rise of anti-Chinese sentiment in Cambodia is the extent to which it's historically unusual. As I said in my presentation, Cambodia has generally viewed China in a benign light. Popular attitudes towards Chinese culture and are surprisingly friendly. It's similar to here in Thailand, where, a large slice of the political and economic elite in Cambodia have Chinese ancestry, and so are generally positively disposed towards China. Most of the nationalist venom has been historically directed towards the Vietnamese. And the question now is whether this current wave of anti-Chinese sentiment proceeds to the extent to which anti-Vietnamese sentiment has historically been embedded. And anti-Vietnamese sentiment in Cambodia is bone deep. It is something that is detached from any rational perception of the threat that Vietnam poses in the present to Cambodia. I always observed when I lived in the country how strange it seemed that there was very little attention directed towards the Chinese presence in the country, which was growing then, if not as visible as it is now. And even Sam Rainsy, the opposition leader, or de facto opposition leader at the moment, he's only really started talking about China in the last couple of years when people in Washington started getting worried about it. But in 2014, he said in a speech to a group of Cambodian voters that he actually supported China's claims in the South China Sea on the presumed basis that, anyone that's an enemy of Vietnam is a friend of Cambodia. And so, I think that a lot of the anti-Chinese sentiment now, my suspicion is that it's very attached to specific grievances that people have, and that if Hun Sen is able to resolve those grievances, such as with the gambling ban, that curbs the worst aspects of the Chinese investment presence in Cambodia, that anti-Chinese sentiment may recede to a manageable degree. But I think that for Hun Sen to have the in terms of the position vis-a-vis the U.S. and China, I think that the Americans also have to be willing to give little as well. There needs to be a sort of compromise. Both sides need to, in order for Hun Sen to have that room for maneuver, there needs to be, that's dependent to some extent on the West giving a bit of ground. And I think, for Prime Minister Hun Sen, survival comes first, and his, the resentments he has about his domestic opponents people like Sam Rainsy, who he clearly loathes. The danger is that those resentments and those domestic political battles will lead Hun Sen astray. It'll lead him into making very unwise international decisions about Cambodia's international alignment. And so whether Hun Sen is given the room to make the maneuverings that I think Kabi is right. I think that he is clearly aware that an overdependence on one nation is not a smart thing, which is why he's so full of praise for the Japanese, who are, unlike the Americans, are remaining engaged and offering Cambodia a much higher quality alternative to the Belt and Road. So yeah, I mean, it really remains to be seen. As Brad said, we're at a really interesting tipping point right now in Cambodia's relationship with the United States and other Western governments as well.
Right, thanks. Jay, what do you obviously...
Well, the brewing backlash against China in Cambodia is not unique to Cambodia. So there's a backlash against China in other countries too. And the brewing backlash in Cambodia against China is contingent on China's reaction to it. And I think China is learning by doing. If you look at the first Belt and Road Forum, the speech, Xi Jinping's speech, and you compare that to the second BRF, Xi Jinping speech, much more accommodating, much more workable, flexible, and a bit more pragmatic, talked about debt sustainability, clean growth, and so on, much less aggressive and belligerent compared to the first Belt and Road Forum. So that's an example of China adjusting its ways for what it wants to do. So if China continues to be nuanced, so this could alleviate some of the pressure, some of the backlash. Second, I think, the deliverables. So if Chinese presence and investment and tourism and engagement in Cambodia, its entire role, if it can still deliver jobs and growth and so on, this is a key factor. If it doesn't, then I think the backlash can exacerbate. At the end of the day, people go home, they have salaries and jobs and so on. They might not like the day, they might not like the boss, the employer, but they have food to eat and they have income. Moreover, is there an alternative? It's brewing backlash against China. Well, is there another alternative for investment and funds and infrastructure? If there is, then the backlash could build a little bit more. And finally, I would say also it depends on the domestic coercion and management. You can have backlash, you can have people unhappy, but they'll be suppressed. Hun Sen, just to touch on one of the earlier points, he's not dogmatic, he's pragmatic. And you can see, I look at the Thai example, Hun Sen for a long time was a Thaksin ally. 2005, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, Hun Sen, had a running spat with Thaksin's enemies in Thailand. But when Thaksin kind of lost his way and when his opponents really got the upper hand after the 2014 coup, Hun Sen switched sides just like that. I mean, he gets along really well. I mean, Thai-Cambodian relations better than ever, very good, as close as ever, certainly as close as the Thaksin era. So it could be, if the Trump administration or another administration, if the U.S. gets a better hold, a better position on China, Hun Sen can switch side as well. So he's not static, he's not dogmatic in that way. But the language that he understands and works with, I think is a different kind of language. So for the military leaders in Thailand, when they seized power in May 2014, one of the first things they did was just kick out the Cambodian workers back to Cambodia. That created a lot of headache for Hun Sen. He understood that language. He accommodated. He got the message.
Right, thanks. That's a very good point, actually. And Bradley, do you have...
I'll be quick. I know we want to get to...
Well, and also about this issue of if he can reconcile the backlash issue with his aspirations to perpetuate either himself or his dynasty.
So I think there's a in addition to the online gambling ban, there's a PROCOS, administrative order that it's making its way through the system right now that essentially bans foreigners from a certain list of professions. We've seen Chinese working as tuk-tuk drivers, I know, because I've had one. We've seen them in multiple small businesses that basically the Cambodian, for lack of lower middle class, working really see as their turf, etc. So there has been another action against this. I think there's two aspects here. One is the fact that, broadly speaking, if pressed, obviously the prime minister is looking towards succession, is obviously looking to a family dynasty. I mean, trying to recreate, as we saw with Nursultan Nazarbayev in Kazakhstan, some element of the Singapore model and so on and so forth. Of course, it's harder to do as a much poorer country. But at the same time, the prime minister's ultimate control over the CPP is not fully there at this stage, and his sons are both still relatively younger and inexperienced. So there needs to be deeper consolidation over the party by the prime minister in order for that to take place successfully. At the same time, the sons basically need a great deal of more experience, although they have obviously their particular one has their power base in the military, which is quite useful. But we're not there yet where solid succession is going to take place, hence why I yield to the Singapore model, a Goh Chok Tong style figurehead, basically with a senior position being taken by the prime minister. But the variable that I think that everyone's missing when, not our panel necessarily, but in general discussion of Cambodia, is how deeply imbibed the view has been that the last 5 years of 7% GDP growth and constant investment from China. Now, many folks who also will share in the same breath a personal experience that has hurt them deeply in terms of their view of the Chinese population, whether it is walking into a restaurant and having no one there speak Khmer. Only Mandarin. I mean, I've been with Khmer colleagues and have had to translate from Mandarin in places where nobody speaks it. But the variable we're missing is when you've had 5 years of 7% GDP growth, consistent growth, and we're ultimately overdue for a recession. And you're a country like Cambodia where 17% of GDP is garments, another 20% is tourism. That's 30% of GDP that's fundamentally based upon two heavily recession-scary industries, along with huge amounts of construction investment heavily coming from China. Now, let's assume we enter recession. China enters recession. We know it's going to be more painful than the last one in terms of we don't have, China's not just able to buy its way out of it. It doesn't have the tools at this stage. If we see deeper capital controls, if we see basically some repatriation of cash from Cambodia into China, we see the collapse of Chinese investment into Cambodia. Now that fundamentally alters both the domestic political dynamics of the country as well as results in an enormous backlash, a generational change for China's policy both in Cambodia but also for all the other countries that are increasingly dependent on China as their primary aid provider or for their investor. When you've built up such high expectations and if you can't fulfill them, that's setting yourself up for a problem. And I think that the variable of, well, what happens after the next recession, that's going to be the determining factor as to where things move forward in Cambodia and throughout the region.
Thank you. And Kawi, I think also we should address that issue of people sort of this impression now that China's falling off a cliff, which I think is overdone actually, but there's already fears setting in about the China slowdown factor and how it impacts on the region. But anyway, Kawi, back to the Hun Sen.
I'd like to go back to the succession question. I think Hun Sen is well prepared for the futures. He's now determined whether two sons between the Hun Mani and Hun Mane who will prevail, because each of these two sons have certain characteristic and strengths that Hun Sen is looking for. He has not yet decided, but that will come sooner than later. Of course, it will take a long time. Hun Sen said he needs another 10 years, but I don't think he will have that kind of time for him, because as the panelist has mentioned to you, there's a lot of external pressure. Patrick Murphy will arrive soon and has made a statement, for me, I don't have a very good impression of Patrick Murphy, what he would do for Cambodia. I think he will emphasize democratic and independent aspect of Cambodia in its relation with the U.S., which is very difficult at this time. And I think if Cambodia allowed Sam Rainsy to return, or he sneak in, that would be disaster for Cambodia. And I think that will not happen. I don't think Sam Rainsy will be allowed in, whether through Thailand, through Singapore, or whatever. I think, for me, I'm pretty sure, because if Sam Rainsy get in, it will cause a lot of trouble. Now, I think Hun Sen knows, and he's playing the game pretty well, though, with Chinese, with other major power. But the biggest problem is to deal with his own party. At the moment, his own party thinks that, you put too much emphasis to your own family. There are other so-called original PAP people that, like Sa King, like other leaders who wants to share in this leadership. But I think Hun Sen need to work that out. And still, as I said, his obsession is to be the father of New Cambodia. He knows he cannot compete with King Sihanoukville, but he has the ability, he's very mercurial, the ability to create a situation wherever he's taking, and I think he will be able to survive. And remember, this is my own take, Hun Sen will step down whenever he wants. You cannot force him to step down. By design, cannot. Only Hun Sen will step down by his own free will, and he will do so. And I think it will be sooner than later, not 10 years, maybe in the next few years' time. That's my take.
Thank you. I think we will turn to questions, and I can see we have a duel going on over the microphone. No. Yeah. Okay. Please identify yourself. Jonathan Head.
Thank you, Gwen. Jonathan Head from the BBC. I just want an assessment from, I was going to say from the panel, but I suspect this goes to Jay and to Kawi, which is how significant would it be if Cambodia did allow China to run a large-scale military base from its own territory? I mean, a naval base, basically.
Well, good question. I don't think Thailand would agree with that. At the moment, Thailand did not say anything. And I don't think, given what's the evidence, even though people believe that this is what's happening, I still have doubts in my mind. I remember in 1989, when I covered the incidents which lead ASEAN to admit Myanmar, because of the Chinese setting up, as you might know, also we covered that Coco Islands. As it turned out, it was not true. But that was the incidents that turned out, that pushed ASEAN to make a decision. In January in 1989, I was covering that we must, actually Mabubani was the one who said that Chinese is coming to Myanmar. We better include Myanmar into ASEAN as soon as possible. So this kind of news that came out, and I think you still need more evidence, whatever, because, I also cover many incidents of that sort. So I think if it's happened, I don't think you will be, Thailand will be happy, because after all, Thailand now is engaging, has its own dilemma, because it has all the, as you know, one submarine, but we get 2 free. So we will have 3 submarines, which will be stationed in Sattahip. And as you know, Sattahip is not only for the commercial, is used to be the only, privilege of the United States to use as whatever air bases. Now you will have submarine bases in Sattahip. That will add into complication. Already the Chinese already have this kind of presence within Thailand, and you add this in Sihanoukville or whatever near the border of Thailand, I don't think that's going to happen, or it will fit in very well in the future.
Right. Well, frankly, I don't think it's up to Thailand either, but Thailand itself is in a very tricky position in terms of its own relationship with China. But anyway, I'm going to turn over to Jay, who's much more expert at this than most of us.
Well, I would have to a 2-pronged response, Jonathan. I think first, it's not going to be, I don't think it will be a kind of a full-fledged military base as such. It's a very hot topic, and I think you can have a creeping base facilities and servicing agreement, and it can be kind of a functional basing facility and right. and might come up in the coming months. I think sooner rather than later. China really wants it. It's critical for China to complement its South China Sea dilemmas, all these artificial islands. Second, it's going to lead to it's going to exacerbate superpower tensions and accelerate the military buildup, the arms race in the region. Yeah.
Right. Thank you. Anyone else want to comment? No, we've got another question. Please identify yourself.
Samurai Club member. I wish to address the issue of backlash through another interpretation of Pol Pot as given through Chandler in his classic book, Brother Number One, in which he suggests, yes, that Pol Pot was put into place by China, Vietnam, and the French communists, but that once he was in power, he genocided the Chinese, according to Chandler, and the emptying of Phnom Penh, which was totally emptied, was done because it was seen as Pol Pot as a Chinese city. And so, as a representative of the Khmer, the backlash that perhaps is showing here isn't just to recent circumstances, but more deeper rooted in the nationalistic German kind of against the Jews, Pol Pot against the Chinese. The Khmer do not like the physical Chinese in their country. So it's a deep issue that Hun Sen, who was a former Khmer, has to deal with.
Well, yeah, I can see you, both of you want to, okay, how about if you want to say something, and then Bradley, yeah?
I think it's important to draw a distinction between political persecution, which the Chinese have faced quite a bit of in the 20th century, and sort of the grassroots anti-Chinese sentiment, which we're starting to see now, but which I argued before is actually relatively, has been relatively scant in Cambodia compared to other countries in Southeast Asia. So, yeah, the Sihanouk's government and Lon Nol's government both introduced a range of restrictions on ethnic Chinese. A lot of it had to do with the fear that they were waving the little red book around and that they were, likely to be used as a fifth column by Beijing in order to infiltrate communist ideas into Cambodia. And then in the 1980s, the Hun Sen's government, in fact, they also sort of mirrored Vietnam's contemporaneous anti-Chinese campaigns. I think in the context of what the Khmer Rouge did to the Chinese, I would probably interpret that as, they sought to root out any foreigners, and also the fact that the Chinese were predominantly urban. They were, and the city was sort of seen as a den of impure attitudes and bourgeois sort of sensibilities, and so the city itself, the fact that the Chinese predominated there might account for the fact that the Cambodian Revolution devoured the vast majority of Chinese. But at the same time, Pol Pot was very happy to establish a very close relationship with the People's Republic of China, and in fact, a lot of the ethnic Chinese who were worked to death or carted off to prison camps and executed by the Khmer Rouge often, were did so under the eyes of advisors from China who didn't raise a finger in their protection. So that's how I would interpret that. But yeah.
So I think if we scroll back and look at of the non-ethnic Khmer populations that are killed from 75 to 79, the Vietnamese take, it's the largest percentage. I mean, it's over 80 or 90% of the ethnic Vietnamese population are killed. Something around 70 to 80% of the ethnic Cham population, Cambodia's indigenous Muslim population, and the Chinese come in third. And Margaret Slocum's work, her excellent economic history, does depict the very strong economic influence of the ethnic Chinese community in Cambodia. No surprise enterprise there. We see that in other countries across the region as well, in the villages and money lending and so on and so forth. It also goes to, in terms of sort of the idea of a Khmer identity that is fundamentally defined against China. I mean, I think that's just, I mean, we go back to Benedict Anderson, we go back to sort of theories of identity formation, and I just have never seen sort of Khmer identity as formed against, as China being the other against which Khmerness is defined. Exactly. Yeah. Rather, but today, I think it's also most interesting, where what we see is there is a change, because some of the most intense anti-China sentiment that you hear in Phnom Penh is from Sino-Khmer, from Chinese Cambodians who have been there for multiple generations, or at least 2 or 3, who speak usually Chaozhou or Hokkien dialect, and so there is there is the possibility of a shifting of who that other is. And if it is the case that the main influence in Cambodia is from the from the new Chinese, from the mainlanders, then that could have an impact in terms of who the other against which Khmer identity is defined becomes. But it's distinct in the sense that the Sino-Cambodians, and I mean, which is a huge percentage of the urban population, particularly the middle and upper middle class. I mean, the intermarriage is enormous. I mean, a colleague back in 2003 in Phnom Penh, when I asked what percentage of the Cambodian middle class is ethnically Chinese, at least partially, he said, "Well, it's everybody. I mean, including me. I'm a quarter Chinese." But that group is not basically saying, "Oh, well, they have done business and do work with and can act as intermediaries." They're pretty much we haven't seen any real gap, at least in terms of the initial survey stuff, of if you're ethnic Chinese, if you have a higher or lower negative view of the mainland Chinese new arrivals.
But what I also saw was that a lot of them are urbanized, right? They're urban populations rather than the farmers out in the countryside. Yeah. So similar, in a way, Thailand is a bit like that, right? Although that's more concentrated in Bangkok, maybe. One more question. And then I think we'll wrap it up after this. If there's no more questions, we can take 1 or 2 more, perhaps. Please identify yourself.
Oh, thank you, Gwen. My name is Daniel Hayward. I'm an Australian. I'm a member of the FCCT, membership number 33520.
That's all right, Daniel. So not necessary.
I would like to say how much I've enjoyed the remarks and the presentations from our panellists, and some of it may have been slightly concentrated around foreign investment into Cambodia and the influence of particularly Chinese foreign investment and the security of the South China Sea, or the military relevance of perhaps military or naval bases in Cambodia. Sebastian, I think you finished your remarks by saying Cambodia is in need of fragile and creative diplomatic assistance. And I'm just wondering, if you take out the economic direct foreign investment and the military relevance of perhaps its location and its future relevance, if you take those 2 things out, what would be, what would be some of the other diplomatic initiatives that you would hope would progress peace, economic progress and stability?
Well, I was speaking about the need for, Cambodia and the United States to arrest the spiral of mutual incomprehension that has pushed relations to this point. And I think it requires pragmatism on the part of the United States and a willingness to be flexible on the part of the Cambodians. I think that, in my initial presentation, I sort of talked about the way Cambodia had become this special project, and that had profoundly shaped Western perceptions of the country, and pushed relations to a point where, Hun Sen saw his best option as embracing China, and in some ways sleepwalking into an unhealthy dependence on this country. And so I think that, what I was basically saying, I think the United States, the problem with the American position in Cambodia is that, often Americans, people in the American government or observers in the U.S. act as if Cambodian history began in 1991. Very few people acknowledge the 1980s, which was a period when the U.S. was involved in a very cynical Cold War accommodation with the Chinese and the Thais that involved supporting indirectly and diplomatically the remnants of the Khmer Rouge government. So until July 1990, the Americans were supporting this group, the group that was responsible for the death of an estimated 1.7 million people in the country. And then 4 years later, they're lecturing Hun Sen's government, or the then government, of which Hun Sen was a co-prime minister. They're lecturing them about accountability. And I think that this really stuck in the craw of people like Hun Sen. And his, during periods of tension with the U.S., he, gave voice to his resentments. I mean, the anti-American rhetoric of the last couple of years has, erupted periodically and strategically over the past few decades. And so, I think that, I think that the U.S. has to adopt a much more balanced and pragmatic perspective or approach towards Cambodia, and the Cambodians also need to try to understand how the American political system works. I think they often hear the very critical remarks that come out of the U.S. Congress, and I'm not sure that they often fully get that the Congress and the executive are, independent of one another. And yeah, I think both sides need to act quickly because relations right now are on the cusp of crisis.
Right, thank you. Okay, final question of the night. Please identify
Thank
yourself.
you. My name is Mira Kim. One of you said Hun Sen is not dogmatic, but pragmatic. The second thing is Xi Jinping ignored or less estimated Deng Xiaoping. One of you said that. And then I thought about these artificial islands in South China Sea. Is there anyone near Cambodia? Well, probably Vietnam. The northern part share the same tradition as Korea, from the Han Dynasty. Those are my 3 points.
Right. Do you have
Either
a question
or answers or comments from the panel, please. Thank you.
Well, since I think you said pragmatic, not dogmatic, and we've had your point about the South China Sea, Jay.
I'm not sure whose point.
I don't know what more you can say about that, but do you have some thoughts?
Was there a question?
I wasn't quite. I think we were invited to make any comments. Was that your? Yeah, to riff.
Okay, well, I'll say first comment. I think Hun Sen has heard us, and he's very angry because it's thundering outside.
He's not a god yet.
There's another point that we haven't mentioned that I want to mention, which is that we haven't talked about the CNRP. There's a moral imperative here. We kind of talked over this. This is an opposition party that's been dismantled. It's been crushed. I mean, people have been jailed. And the party was not allowed to run in the last election. Had it run, it probably would have won, especially if Cambodian workers in Thailand were allowed to vote. So we talk about Hun Sen, about the future, about South China Sea, U.S. and China, and all of that. So I want to add that don't forget that there is a opposition party. They don't have a good plan. They want to re-enter Cambodia. It sounds very outlandish that they're going to go through Thailand or Laos or somewhere or Singapore. But nevertheless, I think that they fear marginalization and irrelevance. And I think that something has to be done about that.
Like what?
I think the Europeans are thinking about the EBA.
Right.
I think there's always a dilemma about sanctions and how much pain it will cost and all of that.
And whether it could
the U.S.
have it
had a Cambodian Democracy Act, but I think it's more kind of we will see. It's going through the Senate, and it's interesting. The Trump administration, if it sees, I always see the Trump administration as interest first. But if it sees that it's in its interest to push back against China in other ways, like pushing against, for democracy, for example, it could do that. The Patrick Murphy coming in, his time was mostly from the Obama administration, but now he's working under a new administration. So it would be interesting if there's a reset in this relationship or not. And I could see one. I think that the White House running one policy, the State Department apparatus seems to be sometimes on a different track.
Exactly.
So that's something that we could also think about U.S., but also the EU. Certainly, the EBA would be. It would hurt the Cambodian economy. It would make Hun Sen think, but also then, of course, the downside: Cambodian workers could be hurt, undermined, and also it could push Hun Sen further into China's orbit.
Can I add one thing?
Yeah.
When we talk, the Trump administration seemed to signal a shift towards a more transactional, pragmatic policy towards the world. Trump said in his inaugural speech that we will not impose our values on anybody. And so we've seen people like Prime Minister Najib go to Washington.
Doesn't have any values.
Right, exactly. But strangely, Cambodia is yet to benefit from that turn towards realism and pragmatism. Partly that's because the Trump administration is a little bit incoherent, I think. But I think it's also the fact that Cambodia still is seen as small and unimportant. And, from Hun Sen's perspective, everybody else in the region, General Prayut, has been to Washington and gone to the White House. The head of the Vietnamese Communist Party, not even the leader of the government, has gone to the White House. Duterte has been invited, although he's declined the invitation, but he's been invited. That is the thing that Hun Sen craves the most. And the only way that he can process that contradiction, that why haven't I gotten an invitation, that is at the core of the crisis in Cambodia and U.S. relations. That even in the Trump administration that is supposedly more pragmatic and transactional and not interested in values, Cambodia is still not benefiting from that. And from Phnom Penh's perspective, that looks an awful lot like, they want us out and they're going to stop at nothing.
But you don't think that he feels that the step too far is locking everybody up in the opposition and dismantling?
Sure.
I mean, not even Duterte has done that. He only kills drug dealers.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, it's the fact that somebody like Duterte is responsible for more deaths in peacetime since the Khmer Rouge, yet because the Philippines is an important is a treaty ally of the United
military
States.
Is actually.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. And then Duterte.
But I mean, there are. Hun Sen is not the only authoritarian in Southeast Asia, and so, it presents a challenge, and I think the Cambodians should be a little bit more flexible too on that question. But it seems, like I said, survival comes first, and I think that maintaining his grip on power domestically will override what is arguably in Cambodia's best interest in terms of its foreign policy.
Okay. And, I did say the last question, but if yours is very short, I think, can we have one more, please?
Sure.
Yeah, okay. Identify yourself.
There's been a lot of mention of the...
Can you just identify yourself and
Sorry,
ask
Kevin Whitcraft, not a journalist. There's been a lot of mention of antipathy of the Cambodians against the Vietnamese. But no one has mentioned actually the role of the Vietnamese in all of this. Hun Sen has benefited quite a bit from the Vietnamese at different times in his career, in the 80s, 1997. Just wondering what that is, and is there a bridge too far for the Vietnamese and the relations of Cambodia with China, or a naval port too far?
All right.
Sebastian's probably
Yep.
better at this than I am. On the naval base, absolutely. The next morning after that story came out in the Wall Street Journal, we had a Vietnamese vice minister of defense on the first flight into Phnom Penh, driving over to the Ministry of Defense without an appointment to discuss this. So for Vietnam, that's a naval base too far, or a naval base too close rather. So in that sense, it's completely unacceptable. But then of course this is the great complexity of Cambodian elite politics, is that there are the interlocking ties and relations between various elements of the CPP and Vietnam that continues. And the question and this is where elite politics always get messy, is trying to figure out, well, who's got the relationship with Vietnam, who's got the relationship with China, and so on and so forth. For the rest, though, I'm going to yield to the biographer of Hun Sen, who has more expertise.
Well, I think up until the announcement of that, potential military access to the Cambodian military base, Hun Sen had managed to balance China and Vietnam fairly successfully. I think both of those countries are engaged with different, like you said, different elements of the Cambodian party and government. They both offer Hun Sen different things. In the conversations I've had in Hanoi with people at the Diplomatic Academy, they always communicate that they're very understanding of Cambodia's position, very understanding about Cambodia's need for development and investment. Behind closed doors, perhaps in the Ministry of Defense in Hanoi, they might be thinking slightly differently, but I think the Vietnamese know Hun Sen well, and they know that he is a Machiavellian figure. And I think as long as China-Vietnam relations remain relatively stable, that is really the determining factor. I think if there was to be a serious conflict between those two countries, then Cambodia would probably polarize in one direction or the other, probably in the direction of China. But as long as Hanoi-Beijing relations remain stable, and I think that they probably will because there's too much at stake for either side, despite the recent tensions, Cambodia should be able to continue to maintain this balance. But the whole question, the question really is what is behind this report about this naval presence. That could really change the equation, and we just have to wait and see to exactly, if and when construction begins on something or more information comes out.
But can I just clarify, to be clear, like the one report, the Wall Street Journal one, was about China leasing an existing Cambodian military facility, exclusive access, but the previous one that's been around for the last year and a half that all of us journalists here have been trying to follow up is the one about the stealth military base that is being built under the guise of a holiday resort with a 3.5 kilometre airstrip, which is clearly not for like tiny little tourist planes, but can land a full-blown, huge air carrier from
well, it's impossible to know until it's actually...
So that's a Chinese resort, so I suppose we're talking...
it could all be dual use, but... until there's some sort of conflict, maybe it is just a tourist resort, and that's the thing. It's very hard to know exactly what's going on there. Right. It's certainly suspicious.
Right. But I think, Koei, you had something to say.
Just want to add to Sebastian, Vietnam support Hun Sen. That was the latest analysis. Because to have other party than Hun Sen, it would be disaster for Vietnam. So make clear that. And Hun Sen was very clever. Every year you have to pay respect to Vietnamese veteran who helped invasions. I should not say the word invasion. It's a friendly assistance. Otherwise, we get all protests. And actually, the way Vietnam and Cambodia react strongly to Singapore was a very clear indication they're on the same page. So make no mistake. Vietnam, in their analysis, Hun Sen is their best bet, and it will continue to do so. And the relation with the veterans is also very interesting because Hun Sen has to dish out a lot of money giving cash to the veterans who played an important role during 1979 incidents.
How many would that be, do you think?
About $250-ish.
No, how many people would that be?
Oh, there's a lot. I have no figure, but that's
quite a lot.
actually one of the intimate things that Hun Sen has done.
Right. Can I just add finally, this is a staggering thing. I found out last year, and I've always thought it's interesting that no matter what you say about the, on the higher levels, the relationship and the mutual recognition of need, but when I was interviewing the head of a very, very big multinational consumer goods group here that's manufacturing in Vietnam and Thailand, they said that they bring product into Cambodia to sell from both their Vietnamese and Thai factories, but they said they have a real problem, and after a while they had to pull all product that was made. This is a group like Unilever. I'm not saying it is Unilever, but that Cambodian consumers actually know the barcodes. So they track the barcode on a product to make sure it's not made in Vietnam. They'll buy the Thai-made one, but they'll run their code reader over to make sure. That's how much, I was staggered. And they've given up trying to sell the Vietnamese-made product in Cambodia. I don't know if it's still as bad. This was a year ago. So anyway, leave you with that thought. I'd like to thank our excellent panel for really great. I thought everyone was balanced, gave us a great picture. And thanks everyone for coming, and I really hope you brought an umbrella, and don't forget about all the good events we've got coming up over the next week. I did forget to say there's also a tango night, right, Richard? Next week on the 26th, on Thursday, we had a very successful night recently where a tango instructor came, and for very little money you can have a tango lesson, and there's people to dance with here. We clear the floor. So if anyone fancies twirling around, please. No one will laugh. Everyone's bad. There's only a couple of good people. Nigel, thanks for lasting.